talked about in class for your main points and talk about kind of how and why you would do those. The hardest part is doing it. So let's talk about how we get there, okay? So we're going to look at this example paragraph. This is from the Iliad, and we'd be talking about what happens to Achilles at the end of the Iliad, right? So our first one would be chronological, and we know at the end of the Iliad, Patroclus dies. So in this case, it's really easy to just take the events and put them in order. That's what chronological is. So we have our main points here. First, we know he feels grief. He's sad when his friend dies, right? After that, he gets upset, so he feels vengeful. And then finally, he feels forgiving, okay? So that would just be, boom, going in order. I think the benefits of this one is it makes the most logical sense, like when you're reading it, right? I also think that this one is a nice style because a lot of the times our stories go in order, so it kind of lends itself to that. The trick is how we describe it in our second prove it's here, so we want to make sure that as you're doing that, you're really talking about how and why one leads to the next. It's not just putting them in order, right, necessarily, but you're saying, okay, this leads to this. Grief leads to vengeance. Vengeance eventually had him come back to his senses, and then led to forgiveness. So you really need to make sure you're describing that well. Okay? We're not spending much time on that one because I think we kind of naturally write that way. We're going to now move to order of importance. So this one's different. So you can keep the same main points if you would like. You might change some of your main points. But in this case, we need to think about that event. So in this case, Patroclus dying, right? And think about what is most important. Well, we know that when he dies, it leads Achilles to make poor decisions, which ultimately reveals his fate at the end of the Iliad, getting shot in the heel, right? So without that event, he might not have been in that position, maybe because he was cursed, but that's a whole different thing, right? But in that case, we need to think about what's most important. So I would say in this case, I'm going to switch up the ideas that I already had and say first he feels vengeful, right? That is not the order that it happens necessarily, but it's more important because it's that vengeance that leads him to do different things, right? You will notice that my prove it's here are a little bit different. So I don't just say this proves because. I'm going to explain deeper why vengeance comes first, because it doesn't come first in the book, right? We first have a chapter called Achilles' grief and then go to vengeance and then forgiveness. So I need to have a different explanation here. I can't just use the same one, okay? After that, I said forgiven. I think that's really important too, to see that arc of his character. He goes from very upset to eventually coming to his senses. That's important. Like, we need to know that happens because that makes him a dynamic character. It makes him more than just chilling by the boats Achilles that we saw for most of the story. Again, you're going to explain it differently here, down here in your prove it. That's going to be a little bit different. So make sure you really dig into that and then look at the example here, okay? And then finally, grief at the end. Yes, it's important that it's in there, but I don't think it's the most important. I think that in this case, we need to know what's important first. So we kind of go, okay, he does this. Yes, he does feel grief, but we kind of blow past that one a little bit because it's not as important as some of the stronger feelings that he feels, okay? So that one would be order of importance. You need to kind of think about how do I want to organize these. I think it's a strong way to go if you go with most important first. Okay? All right, and then finally, natural connections. So this one, again, is going to feel kind of weird. There's no formula for this, so it takes practice. But this one is taking kind of everything that happens and connecting the dots. You might not use the same main points in this one, okay? So for instance, we do start with Achilles' grief, right? So again, that event, Patroclus dying, boom, takes him into that state of grief. But then we're going to think about what comes next, all right? So instead of vengeance, I said rage this time. To me, that's more of a natural connection, right? He wasn't immediately out for blood. He kind of felt that anger or that rage first, which led him to that deeper state of vengeance. So I naturally connected those two. So grief kind of led to that. I changed my quote. I changed my explanation here because it's not the same. And then I realized as I was writing this, you know what? He actually becomes impulsive, right? He acts pretty quickly on that rage. You could call that vengeance, but I'm going to call it impulsive. He does not think through his choice of dragging the body around Troy, and he does not think about the consequences that's going to bring. That's impulsive. So again, I had to change my quote and my explanation, and this kind of led me to a different ending of my paragraph. It showed more of the consequences, I would say, of his impulsivity versus just how he felt. That's deeper thinking, guys. So that's showing a lot more. You're really connecting the dots here. You're not just, boom, popping them in, right? He does this, this, and this. Think about what are the consequences of that? What are the impacts? What happens next to him? had he not done those things, would his fate be different, right? So that's going to be what we do for natural connections. I know that's a quick explanation, but I invite you to really read this paragraph, go through it, and think about how did the one lead to the other, and what consequences or impact come from that. Okay? Awesome, guys. Hope this helps.